Let's take you to that interview now. Our political editor, Andrew Clennell, sat down with the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, where Peter Dutton was particularly strong. He says he is willing to muscle up to Donald Trump in the national interest.
Peter Dutton, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
How are you feeling this close to an election when you're behind in the news poll?
Look, I feel pretty relaxed about where we're at. I think we've done a lot of work in policy. We've done a lot of work in understanding what Australians are going through, and I think we can frame ourselves as a better alternative over the next 3 years than what people have experienced over this 3 years.
Shouldn't you be ahead now? I mean, it's hard for a Prime Minister to have a defeat like The Voice and for everyone's living standards to decline so much, albeit there's low unemployment. One would think you would be ahead. Maybe not by a great margin, but you're not.
Well, it hasn't happened since 1931 that a first-term government has lost, and that's not for any insignificant reason. The fact is that people normally pick and stick, and I think they would normally give the benefit of the doubt to a government like this. But I do think there's an incredible softness in the numbers, and I do think as we move around the country, it's obvious that people are still worried about the cost of living pressures that they're under, small business failures, they're worried about the cost of energy. They're worried about what a Labor Greens minority government would mean for them and their families, and indeed for our country. I think the Prime Minister's dropped the ball in relation to national security, and there are other factors that I think will come into play as we get closer to the election. And I think on that basis, we can be in a good position to win.
Well, what's going to give you the momentum? I mean, he keeps saying he's kicking with the wind in the last quarter.
Well, you have a read of some of the transcripts and the interviews he's doing. There's a lot of hubris there, and I think he thinks it's in the bag. I think Australians might make a different judgment by polling day. But there's a lot of water to go under this bridge yet, and I think a lot of policy to come out, a lot of contemplation. And when people compare the pair, they're going to see a Prime Minister who has let them down over the last 3 years, broken his promise about $275 power bill reductions. They've gone up by $1,300, and that's just the start of the financial pressures families are under. And on the other hand, we have a positive plan to manage the economy effectively, to keep Australians safe, to make sure we can help young Australians realise the dream of home ownership, and also deliver a quality healthcare system. And that's the choice that people will have at the next election.
Was it a tactical mistake to say no to Labor's tax cuts?
No, I don't think so. And I think if you look at some polling out earlier this week, if you're to be guided by that, I think the government's tax measure was supported by 51%. Our 25 cent a litre reduction in the petrol tax, so diesel and petrol down by 25 cents under our plan, starting straight away if we're elected, that was at 68%. So when people have heard it, when they know the two offerings, then I think they default to ours, and people know that the 70 cents a day tax cut starting in 15 months' time, it just doesn't cut it, given that the average family is $50,000 worse off under this government. So I think
just waved it through. It would have been quite easy to do.
Well, why vote for us if we're just a carbon copy of the Labor Party? That's not what I've stood for.
But that's actually a question about why match the bulk billing promise but not tax cuts as the party of lower taxes?
Because I strongly believe in the fact that the government has broken the Medicare system. When I was Health Minister, the bulk billing rate was at 84%. Today it's at 77%. I do believe that we need to get more GPs into the system, and it costs money to be able to do that. But in relation to how we could reduce taxes for families, don't forget that income tax is just one element of taxes that people pay. People pay GST, they pay taxes on all sorts of services at a state level, at a local government level, and the overall tax that is paid by a family is also made up, for most families, particularly in outer metro areas, by the fuel excise. And so our decision was for that family, or for that pensioner, or for that small business. And the beauty of the 25 cent a litre reduction in petrol and diesel under our plan is that it is economy-wide in its benefit.
But it's 12 months only.
Well, it's 12 months to be reviewed at the end of that period.
So you might do it again?
Well, if we think that there is a longer period of recovery required from Labor's mess, then we'll look at any measure to try and provide relief to Australians.
I know you're not going to do income tax cuts yourself in this campaign. Are there any other tax cuts, instant asset write-off things, anything like that we can look forward to?
Well, we've made the announcement in relation to instant asset write-off. So the government has said to small businesses, 29,000 of whom have failed over the last 2.5 years. That's a record number in our country's history of small business failures. And behind everyone is somebody who's lost their house, somebody who's lost their life savings, somebody who's lost their dream or their job. And this government has nothing to say about it. So what's the government saying to small business? Well, they're going to provide $1,000 for instant asset write-off. Our figure is $30,000, and that will make a big difference to businesses, as well as our $20,000 deduction for businesses, for small businesses to go in and spend money in. I was in Berwick today, where we went to have a bite to eat before this afternoon's function. And the restaurateur there said to me, just a sort of a bigger cafe, said, you wouldn't believe how hard it is. And thank goodness you're trying to generate some revenue, some income for us, some support, because I'm in a position where I'm going to have to start putting staff off. And that's the reality for a lot of small businesses. So we've helped small business with those measures. The government has put in place economic settings which have made it really hard for those businesses to succeed.
7:30, Jim Chalmers gives his budget speech. About 7:50, Angus Taylor says, no, we're not supporting that. Had you predetermined if they offered tax cuts you weren't going to support?
We'd been obviously in the budget lock-up, and we looked at the detail the government had provided, and we looked through options that were available to us, and we took a decision for a government that was going into $1.2 trillion worth of debt, and to offer 70 cents a week in 15 months' time, frankly, was a stunt. And I think they're in the LAW category, and I'd be surprised if the Labor Party wins the election, whether they would ever deliver those tax cuts in any case.
Had you done work on your own income tax cuts?
We had looked at all sorts of options, and honestly, we have, I know there are lots of critics out there, but we have spent 3 years literally going backwards and forwards with the Parliamentary Budget Office, looking at dozens and dozens of policies. We've gone through different iterations around tax, around social policy, around defence policy, economic, and so on and so forth. And we've done a lot of work. We've got a lot of options on the table, and many of them depended on what the budget numbers look like as to how much money we had and what we saw as a priority.
You didn't rule out making cuts to the health and education departments today. Could that occur? How can you ensure it's not frontline services? And what about the ABC? Might you cut the ABC?
Andrew, if you have a look at the figures that are in, and this is a point I made today, the figures in the budget now for health and for education, they are the figures that we commit to. So the same funding, the same spending on health and education, we stick to and we commit to. And I've said that we will legislate for that.
But so you might reprioritise some of that funding as well.
Well, if we find waste in the department where there's not a frontline service being delivered, and don't forget that at a federal level, we don't own a hospital. The federal government doesn't run a school. There are funding agreements that are administered by the department, and the department's grown by literally thousands of people. Now, I want a better understanding of what those people are doing and whether it's helping kids in classrooms. Does it help to employ additional public servants in Canberra with classroom sizes, or with additional support for kids with disabilities and with learning difficulties? I'm happy to be convinced of it, but I suspect that what's happened here is what's happened at a Victorian level and at a Queensland level, where the Prime Minister has ceded to the position of the unions, which is not about service delivery, it's about trying to placate the unions.
There's a lot of critics on your side about the ABC, so what about, would you have a look at their budget?
Well, again, I think the approach that we would take is to reward excellence, and to where we find waste, to cut that waste. And there are a lot of regional services for the ABC which I think are underdone. We were out in Western Queensland just yesterday looking at the devastation of the floods, and the ABC could be a much more integral part of that community, but just having it based in Sydney or just being based in Melbourne is not helping people in outer metro areas or regional areas.
And what about the NDIS? They've got this 8% growth target. Do you think there's enough waste there, or ability to reform it to bring that down? Well,
I've always said that I want to see the NDIS remain sustainable, because it's an important program. And I was always particularly taken by, and I've got family in this situation as well, where you've got ageing parents and adult children with disabilities, and the uncertainty about what happens to their kids when the parents pass. So I always thought the NDIS was admirable in its intent in that regard. I worry about the reports that Bill Shorten and others from the Labor Party have put out about organised crime and the waste, and the government's obviously set up a task force I haven't been briefed in relation to the outcomes of that, and there are probably matters that are under investigation. So I think you'd rely on that advice, but committed to the NDIS, committed to equity for people with disabilities, but against waste and rorts and rackets. And I want to see the money go to frontline services and help those who are most in need.
Do you see this as being a khaki election, given you're heavily rumoured to be about to promote, or promise, should I say, more defence spending?
Look, I think when the Australian public hear their Prime Minister and their Deputy Prime Minister say that we live in the most precarious times since 1945 and then rip $80 billion out of defence, something doesn't add up there. And the thing that gives it away is that the Prime Minister can't even stand up and explain his theory on why these surveillance ships are circumnavigating our country. This hasn't happened in this fashion before. And for the government not to have...
They say they came into Sydney Harbour during Scott Morrison.
But there was an arrangement put in place for that to happen. There were months of planning in relation to that. It's chalk and cheese.
Why did they do? Why did we allow them in there?
Well, there's no problem with an arranged visit, and we have cordial relations with many countries. But to turn up and to start exercises without the government knowing about it, that's a complete abrogation of the Defence Minister's responsibility. And now, of course, today, we've got the Prime Minister saying one thing, the Defence Minister saying another about whether it's Border Force or whether it's Defence or who's got the lead here and who's providing the surveillance. It surely can't be Border Force, which would be farcical. It needs to be the Australian Defence response. And I just think the Prime Minister is projecting weakness at the moment, which has never worked well over history. And so I do think there is an element of who do you trust to keep our country safe, both in a defence sense and also in a local law and order and crime sense at this election. I think that is going to be an integral decision for people to make. On
power bills, it feels like the saving you're going to announce isn't going to be as big as $275 a year. And I think I raised this with you at the press conference the other day. Isn't it more from your point of view, because it's hard to get prices down once they're up, stabilising it? People can't expect from you a massive cut, surely.
So just to deal with the issue just quickly, if I can summarise it this way. Electricity's gone up by 32% under Labor. Gas has gone up by 34% in just 3 years. What they're guaranteeing you, what Anthony Albanese is saying at this election, is that he guarantees you that electricity prices will be higher under Labor and gas prices will be higher under Labor if they're re-elected. What I'm saying to Australians is that we need to change the way in which the system works to bring more gas in, and similarly to what we've done with the 25 cent a litre cut on petrol and diesel to make that cheaper for consumers. That's applied across the economy, not just pensioners and families, but also small businesses and bigger businesses, delivery truck drivers. And that's the approach we've taken to gas as well. It has a downward pressure on prices for commercial users of gas, the big manufacturing companies who are employing hundreds of thousands of Australians, their prices come down. The grocery manufacturers, their prices come down, and that has a delivery of savings to people at the supermarket.
So it might be a small household cut, but across the economy it saves.
Well, I think across the economy you'll see a very significant benefit, and this is why some of the big gas companies are, not happy. But the big energy users like BlueScope, the biggest manufacturer of steel in our country, is saying, this is a game changer for them. This will bring down the cost of steel, which is exactly what we should be doing because it's such an integral part of housing construction, road construction, infrastructure construction across the country.
The government wants to compare you to Donald Trump. Is that hurting you? What did you think of his exchange with Volodymyr Zelensky? What do you think about the fact he might be about to screw us on tariffs? How do you manage this if you become Prime Minister?
Well, I think the Prime Minister will go and he'll throw the lines out. He'll get Jim Chalmers and other lackeys to throw the lines out. Ultimately, what people want is a Prime Minister who can stand up for our country. And what they've seen in Anthony Albanese is somebody who doesn't have the strength or the backbone or the will to stand up for our country's interests. He can't stand up to China at the moment.
So you'd have a fight with Donald Trump?
If I needed to have a fight with Donald Trump or any other world leader to advance our nation's interests, I'd do it in a heartbeat. And I'll put the Americans on notice and anyone else who seeks to act against our national interest.
Even if it risks AUKUS?
It won't risk AUKUS. AUKUS will survive, there's no doubt in my mind, because there are too many people in the Republican movement, in the Democrat Party, across the aisle, in the House, in the Senate, who strongly support AUKUS. And the other point I'd make, Andrew, is that AUKUS isn't just a one-way street. AUKUS is of mutual benefit to the US as much as it is to Australia. But I'm not going to allow the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or anyone else to walk over me or to walk over our country. But at the moment, they see a Prime Minister who is weak and flapping in the breeze, and that's why Donald Trump has been able to stand all over Anthony Albanese now. I won't stand for that, and the Prime Minister doesn't have the capacity to stand up for our national interest or for our national security, and the last 3 years have demonstrated that.
On the Reserve Bank decision, how many rate cuts would you envisage in the first term of a Dutton?
Well, it's going to take us time to clean up Labor's mess, as it did for John Howard and Peter Costello to clean up Paul Keating's mess. We want to get the budget back into a decent state. We want to start paying down debt. We want to put money in the bank for the next massive black swan event. And who knows what that is? A big stock market crash, the avian bird flu, COVID, some sort of war in Europe, a war in the Middle East, a war in the Pacific. Who knows what the next century will hold? And again, when the Prime Minister says that this is all about the most precarious period since 1945, wouldn't it be prudent to plan for that, to be in a position of strength and not weakness? We don't preserve peace through weakness, and yet the Prime Minister is going down that appeasement path and that path of impotence. It's just not in our country's best interests, and I believe very strongly that we live in the best country in the world, and we should be prepared to stand up and defend and fight for it, and that's exactly what I intend to do.
I just wanted to ask you for a brief description of a few people, if you don't mind, if you'll play along with me here. Anthony Albanese?
Started with big promise, ended with an incompetence and weakness that I think have really shocked Australians.
Jim Chalmers?
Jim Chalmers, I think, spends a lot of time in front of the mirror, and if only he'd spent more time in front of preparing the budget and dealing with inflation, because he knew it was a big issue and didn't deal with it, and Australians have paid the price for that.
Monique Ryan?
Monique Ryan, I think, is a Green who's pretending to be a teal or a disaffected Liberal, and ultimately people who vote for Monique Ryan are voting for Anthony Albanese.
Angus Taylor?
Angus Taylor, I think, is not only intelligent, but I think has also mastered his brief, and I think he's done an incredible job as Shadow Treasurer. It's one of the toughest jobs in the business, and I think he's done a great job. I think he would be one of our great treasurers in Australia.
Susan Lee?
Susan Lee, again. I came into Parliament with Susan Lee, so I know Susan well, and I think she has a breadth of experience in government and in opposition, and she's been a loyal deputy to me, and she's a good friend.
Adam Bandt?
Well, Adam Bandt represents the most radical party in the Parliament, anti-Semitic, racist party, and yet he'll be there holding hands with the Prime Minister after the election in a coalition, which I think should send a shiver down the spine of every Western Australian and every Australian, because it would be bad for the economy and it would be bad for Australia's international reputation. And yet Anthony Albanese will side up to Adam Bandt in a heartbeat.
Donald Trump?
Donald Trump, I think, is putting his country first, as he's been elected to do, is exactly as I would do if I'm elected as Prime Minister of Australia.
And finally, if you don't win the election, will you hang around as opposition?
Well, I believe that we can win the election, and that's the only focus that I've got. But I've been here, I've shown my commitment over almost a quarter of a century. I'm not a quitter. I don't give in. I've never given in, and I won't for our country, because I believe that this is a sliding doors moment for our country, and I believe if Mr Albanese is re-elected, the times will only get tougher for families and for small businesses. And for me, I want to take control of the budget and the economy, and I want to help our country rebuild after a really bad period of Labor. It would only get much worse if there's a Labor Greens government after the election, and